And welcome back to the podcast. We are joined once again by Erick Ybarra, good friend, and it's always great to have you on the show. It's actually a little bit of a double header today, Erick. I uploaded a video earlier related to metaphysics and grounding, and now we're just going to do a real hard gear shift, as we often do, and talk
Yep.
about the papacy, because you've got a new book out that you've been working on for a long time, and I want to personally congratulate you on its release. I know how hard you've worked on this. It's so cool to finally see it out. It must feel great too. How did it feel to finally, because this is like over a 10-year project, right, for you, and it's
Yes.
finally there. So how does that feel? Tell us. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. 10 years is probably if you want to include like the incubation period where all my thoughts were being gathered. Yeah,
Yep.
it goes far that back. And yeah, you remember when I first met you, I was talking about how I was expecting it to get published, and it just with the original manuscript being 1,100 pages. Um, when they reviewed it, they were like, "This is a great book, but we're gonna have to trim some fat." And what they meant by trim some fat is hundreds of pages. So we got it down to 780 pages, so it's just about 800. And
That's still a meaty boy.
it's still a hefty book, and the
Yeah.
font is tiny. But I'll tell you what, the works cited in the back takes up a lot of that.
Yep.
So and I wanted to make sure that I was interacting with all the older and the newest scholarship on the topic. So
Yeah.
I just went crazy with visiting libraries, visiting bookstores, taking pictures from books,
Yep.
trying to find what I can get off of the free lawful pages on Google. I did everything I could to make citations of books, articles, lectures, presentations, all that stuff. But yeah, like I said, when I first met you, I should have just kept my mouth shut, because almost every day for about 2.5 years, I would get messages, "When's your book coming out?
Of
When's your book
course.
coming out?"
Yeah.
So I learned my lesson now. When you're dealing with a publisher, whatever they expect to be the next step, just add a year to it.
Yep.
And
Oh,
that's
yeah, not that I want to complain too much, but first off, it's always very flattering because I've announced 2 books this year, and I get a lot of messages and email, "Hey, when's it coming out?" And the answer is, I don't know. Gavin and I submitted our manuscript of the book working together way back in March.
right.
We have no idea. We have no idea when that book is going to come out. And then my other book with Sophia, I do have a tentative release date, which is spring. But whenever publishers give you a tentative release date, there's always a heavy emphasis on tentative there. So
Yes. Yep. Yep.
yeah, so we're not trying to jerk people around, right? We want the book out as probably more than anybody, right? When you're the author, but when you're working with publishers, it's not in your hands, really, right?
Yeah, and especially with the topic being the papacy, and in particular the debate between the Orthodox and the Catholics, because uh, I I don't want to say I predicted,
Mm-hmm.
but I was talking about this back in 2018,
Yep.
2017. I had spoken about that there's going to be an exodus coming of people leaving Catholicism for Orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
And it started off as a slow trickle, and now it's enormous.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very loud, because the Orthodox churches in America are still, they're not as the population is not that great.
Right.
So even when people become Orthodox, sometimes they have to travel 2 hours to go to a parish.
Right.
Sometimes they find that the parish is too ethnic centered and they don't feel comfortable anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But at the very least, there's been an exodus of eyeballs looking at Eastern Orthodoxy from within um, the disaffected community
Yep.
within Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I especially knew I needed to put my thoughts down in a documented form, so that way I don't just forget it. I did all the research selfishly, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, for myself, but not really selfishly, because I wanted to be a pure vessel for the Lord. I wanted to know the truth.
Right.
So I did it on my knees. I did it with tons of prayer. I did it at yearning at adoration for the truth, asking God to turn me away from error.
Mhm.
If I find a mistake that's going to be pivotal, please focus my attention on that, and don't lead me into error. So I did that for years and years, and I didn't want the data to just sit in my head. So
Mhm.
that's when I knew I needed to start writing the everything down. I at least wanted my kids to have a source that they could, instead of having to do all the reading and all the traveling that I did. I I've even communicated with people in Greece, France, and using translation tools
Mhm.
to get input from the best of the best scholarship. And I don't want to have my kids redo all that. So I figured
Of
if I
course.
could give them something like this, if the question falls on their lap in the future, which, I'm it might, it's likely if they remain committed Catholics. The discussion seems to be paramount today.
Yep.
Um, so I wanted a resource to put people ahead, instead of having to um, reinvent the wheel. There's several books written on this subject in the past, but not many of them have been updated to keep track with the contemporary nature of the debate.
Right. Yeah. And God bless you, man. And I have nothing but admiration for your sincere pursuit of the truth, and also your thoroughness. You're very, very thorough, and that's why it's great to follow your stuff. Because the truth is, I've certainly been focused on mostly just metaphysical issues that are not entirely unrelated to this, because I think these theological considerations have a lot of philosophical considerations minimally in the background, right? So this is why we're totally cool talking, Catholicism and theology and philosophy for people, because you can't really draw totally neat lines between these things. Um, but it's good for me to have you on and people like Swan on, because it makes me kind of like turn back
Hmm.
into these debates that I haven't been spending as much time on recently. So with that in mind, Eric, I want you to kick this off, and like, where do you want to start with this? In fact, I was talking to a buddy of mine. I said, I'm going to be talking to Eric today. Do you have any questions that you want me to throw his way? And he said, actually, I'd just like to hear Eric's like opening gambit. Like, what's his elevator pitch for the papacy these days? Does he have like one argument that he really likes? Where does he like to get the conversation started? So maybe we could begin there and then get into everything else. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. So, so this, the book that I published is it's called The Papacy, subtitled "Revisiting the Debate Between Catholics and Orthodox." And I wanted to make sure I put revisiting because it's been visited before.
Right.
Don't want to
Mhm.
make this out to be like it hasn't been visited before me. But the whole idea of the book is that if we're if we're going to observe the rules of our sources, meaning scripture and tradition, that's something that Orthodox and Catholics, that is the source of revelation for
Mhm.
us, right?
Right.
So if we're playing by the rules, the sources, the data sources for what we consider to be unquestionably authoritative,
Mhm.
namely scripture and tradition, um, the the divine architecture of a Petrine primacy is unavoidable, right?
Mm.
And then within that door, if you go through that door to find what the essence of that is, you find an authoritative primacy, which is divinely instituted in St. Peter by Christ himself. So that's immediate and direct,
Mhm.
and which is created for the sake of visible unity. So this is where some of the stuff we've talked about before, the a priori considerations, the philosophical expectations of what would be needed in the time-space continuum of mankind, and what is natural,
Mhm.
and what kind of component would be necessary to maintain unity in a human society.
Mhm.
Um, you have this, you have a government, because
Mhm.
without that, how do you run a nation, how do you run a church? Same way. uh that, and that this design is essential to the church, and therefore will last until the the end of time, when the
Yeah.
church is fine, when the whole program that Christ has for the church is going to come to an end when he returns. So when we say it's perpetual, irreversible, non-changeable, however you want to call it, um, it's up to that point where he comes back and reunites with the church.
Mhm.
Um, so what what this does is it basically says, if you're Orthodox and if you're Catholic, the obligation is to assent to that
Mhm. Mhm.
because our sources point to it.
Mhm.
And so obviously the byproduct of that is, if you're Orthodox, you need to reconsider your beliefs,
Mhm.
because the contemporary Orthodox Church basically doesn't believe any of that.
Right.
Now they try to, just like anybody who sees something plain enough in the
Mhm.
data, they try to make it coherent with their system.
Mhm.
But part of my book goes into why it's not coherent with their system.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of philosophy in the book, actually. Some of the chapters, I actually have one chapter on epistemological considerations,
Yeah.
which is really what I think you would be interested in, because um, it kind of goes into this question of how how is the society of Christians supposed to stay on two legs from Pentecost till the Parousia, or the return
Mhm.
of Christ. And what we see in the beginning is definitely a formation of apostolic leadership.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know anybody who reads the Bible, whether they're Protestant, or in any kind of sect, Orthodox or Catholic, that's going to deny that when the apostles were alive and when Jesus was bodily absent, they had the final say on things.
Mhm.
When there was a problem, a question related to theology and faith or morals, uh, they were consulted, and whenever they gave an answer to the question, that question was considered final, and therefore the question should never be reopened, right?
Right.
Because they have the authority to speak for Jesus Christ. So the question is, when the apostles, when they die and go to be with the Lord, what happens after that? Are we simply now looking at infallible texts, and we have to do the best we can to understand what those texts are saying? Or is there some kind of vivifying principle that is active and accessible to our senses, to which we are bound to submit in conscience?
Mhm.
Uh, when it comes to the religious elements of our faith, meaning what we have to believe and what we have to do in order to be a member of the church, be saved, and anticipate future salvation. And uh, this is where Protestants start to say, well, no, there's no after the apostles, that's it. After
Mhm.
that, it's just basically the magisterium of biblical scholars, whatever the best exegete in the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Aramaic, whatever he can find um, and glean, that's the truth. Which, if it doesn't matter if it means revolutionizing what was consensus in the 2nd century, overturning what was consensus for 5 centuries, they're always revisiting the sources and perhaps overturning the prior consensus of things, right?
Right.
Now, Orthodox and Catholics believe there's a vivifying principle
Mhm.
that can infallibly communicate the teaching
Mhm.
of Christ, which doesn't increase in substance, because we believe that divine revelation was given once, so it was delivered once. Scripture and tradition was delivered once, but after it's delivered, like Saint Irenaeus says, it's deposited into the church, and the church is the magister, the teacher, the magisterium. Uh, so both Catholics and Orthodox differ with Protestants in that regard, and so that's very good. That puts us on a more level plane. Um, so the next question is, what do we believe is historically the system that existed, that Christ created and which existed right after the apostles? Was it what the Orthodox teach, which is um, really it's hard to summarize what the Orthodox teach on this, because there's a variety of beliefs on this, but they typically want to move towards something like a consensus based ecclesiology, where there's not one hierarchical apex, like a final court, um, that can make decisions that would instantaneously bind all other courts,
Yeah.
other lower courts, and churches and Christians. Um, so they would want to say that they have a parochial principle where local churches determine things for themselves. Um, and then what developed was the creation of the synod, which is the metropolitan and the bishops around the metropolitan. And then later came the patriarch or the patriarchate, which is another regional boundary with with an apex, a head apex, but his prerogatives and rights are severely limited. They're canonically prescribed, so he's basically hired under conditions. And so if he fails those conditions, he could be ousted out, replaced, ignored, disobeyed, whatever. And so to get things functionally decisive, you've got to have an agreement between the head and the members. So again, consensus based. The head can't make any decisions on his own that's
Right.
going to bind everybody else. The Roman Catholic Church, or the Catholic Church, says that that's not true. It is true that local communities govern themselves. The bishop has jurisdiction over his flock. The metropolitan does have canonically prescribed jurisdiction. So does the patriarch. But that there is a final court of authority, which is divinely binding in especially its doctrinal decrees,
Mm-hmm.
but also its disciplinary decrees. And so the question is, when there's a debate on faith, what is the venue that finally resolves the definition of what has to be believed?
Mm-hmm.
That's really what it comes down to, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first controversy over the use of unleavened bread in Mass and the filioque doctrine that we talked about here
Yep.
not long ago, those things, ricocheted for a while until everybody realized, well, wait a minute, there's a deeper issue here. The deeper issue here is, who has the final authority to say what is the Christian faith or what is not the Christian faith? And the answer that the Catholic Church gave was, well, the history, tradition, scripture, historical practice has always told us that the Apostolic See is the final court of appeal.
Mm-hmm.
And the Orthodox say, well, that's not the case. What's the final authority is the ecumenical council. So both of these structures came to. This is where the debate, comes down to.
Mm-hmm.
So now Catholics do believe that an ecumenical council is a final infallible court when it comes to the faith, but that's because it's conjoined to the subject that has the final authority on faith and morals, which is the Roman pontiff, the heir of Saint Peter.
Sure.
But before we get to that, some people might be wondering, what's the point of infallibility? Like, why even have it? Because, we don't see the New Testament talking about it that often. We don't see the Old Testament talking about it that often. Where does the idea come from? Well, the idea comes from the fact that when it comes to something so crucial as the destiny of our souls, we don't want this to be thrown into the tyranny of human opinion.
Mhm.
because human opinion changes. It changes often. And as elastic as human imagination is, that's how elastic the doctrine of the church would be, if we had no notion of infallibility. So if we only had God delivering his message, and then it gets thrown into the dominion of human thought and opinion, then we could no longer be able to trace back what God actually delivered to us. Do you see?
Mhm. Mhm.
So even Protestants recognize the need for infallibility, even though they circumscribe it into the Old and New Testament. If you take away the infallibility of the Old and New Testament from the Protestant faith,
Mhm.
their entire faith goes down, because now it's just a bunch of documents that might be agreed with, might not be agreed with.
Mhm.
See, um, so it's very important for Protestants, not least Catholics and Orthodox, to say that there is an infallibility doctrine to be had, because
Yeah.
without it, our whole religion is flushed down the toilet with of basically human imagination.
Right.
And as time gets, as we get farther away from the time that God delivered his revelation, the more and more we're going to be questioning what the original was.
Mhm.
A copy is never as good as the original, so a copy of a copy of a copy for many, many years and centuries, um, we just drift down what became axiomatic for historical critical scholarship in the Enlightenment period, which is this. It's you believe Jesus rose from the dead. You don't believe Jesus rose from the dead. It's okay, as long as it makes some sense to you and it makes you live more happy.
Right. Right. Mhm.
So
Yeah, I mean, it would just, I mean, errors would multiply, and even if you thought that it was generally reliable at one time, it seems like only a matter of time until that isn't quite sufficient anymore. Right.
that's right, because
Yeah.
even reliability, because I would say if you take infallibility away, let's say there is no infallibility at all,
Mhm.
I would say you'd still have a reliable way to know what Christians believed in the late first century, maybe the beginning of the second century.
Mhm.
Maybe it's not airtight though, right? But as soon as you start getting further down, it's like, well, whose grimy hands have been fiddling with this faith? you know,
Mhm.
um, who's the winner? If the politics decide what the people are going to believe, well, now things change according to that. So we all have an infallibility doctrine. All Christians need to understand that the concept of infallibility is absolutely inescapable.
It's essential to all Christians, is what you're
Yeah,
saying, right?
that's right.
Right.
That's right.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. Mhm.
You have others like the modernists, Alfred Loisy. You've got a number of the classical guys who came out, and basically denied the infallibility of all the whole Bible, denied the infallibility of tradition. The church was plan B, wasn't even supposed to be what Jesus wanted. um, and what matters at the end of the day then is if you feel good. you know
Sure. Mhm.
but most conservative thinking Protestants, Orthodox, and Catholics, they already recognize that as something of that would be a complete abortion of the
Right.
Christian religion.
Mhm.
Um, so infallibility is unavoidable. It's where we put that infallibility is
Mhm.
the question. And between Catholics and Orthodox, it really comes down to this issue of what did Jesus create in the apostles? Did he just create 12 equal apostles and put them into a college, and whatever is the majority opinion amongst them is what wins the day? What's that? 7-5, or let's see, 6-6-5. I can't. But whatever, the majority of the 12,
Mhm.
um, and that's what's infallible, or are they automatically going to all agree? You know, Or is there some other kind of hierarchical design that was created in order to keep unity walking on 2 feet?
Mm-hmm.
And Catholics would say, not only from the philosophical angle, that having one head, because you have 2 heads, 3 heads, now you can have a conflict between the 3 of them, and basically reach a stalemate, in which case the mystical body of Christ is deprived of being certain of what the truth is,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to a heresy versus orthodoxy. If there's a stalemate between heresy and orthodoxy, well, we still get trapped in heresy
Mm-hmm.
because the stalemate doesn't exclude the heresy.
Right.
So from the philosophical point of view, having a singular head is quite useful.
Mm-hmm.
The utility makes perfect sense, right? But the Orthodox would simply say, and any Catholic should say, that if our construction of that is just based off of human reason, as powerful as that may be, that's still consistent with unreality. In
Of
other
course.
words,
Mm-hmm.
it could be a beautiful necessity in theory without a corresponding reality.
Right.
So then the question is, does the historical data correspond with what we can glean philosophically?
Yeah. And did you ever read Joshua Sijuwadi's article on the papacy?
It's in my list, but I
Yeah.
I I have to get to it sooner or
Well,
later.
he agrees with what you're saying. He thinks you can make that sort of a priori case for why God would set things up this way. But he thinks that isn't going to settle the matter by itself. He thinks that you are going to have to look at history. However, those things in combination, he believes, should be totally decisive, right? The
Yeah.
background philosophical considerations with what we actually find in the historical record, and they should be considered together. He thinks it's a mistake to just consider one or the other. Consider them both,
Yeah.
and he thinks that should be quite convincing to the person who's coming at this with an open mind. I agree with that. You know me. I've always thought that the philosophical considerations were a good one, but they were never totally independent of historical considerations either. I think if anything else, it kind of takes off some of the burden or work you have to
Yes.
do historically, but it doesn't
Yeah.
take it all off, if that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm.
Yes. Actually, I would say that there are some very uneasy inferences and implications if God sort of threw the precious jewels and gold of his revelation into a system that is going to so easily fall victim to disillusion. you
Mm-hmm.
know like, it would be like me giving the most, the if I have an extremely important legal document in my house that's going to decide the fate of the rest of my life, and I decide to give it to my 8-year-old son and his friends to deliver it to, the court or something, or the
Mm-hmm.
Commerce
Mm-hmm.
of Commons, whatever. Christ isn't going to do that and allow the whole purpose and plan of eternal salvation, um, without providentially protecting the delivery, transmission, dissemination of that gospel to save the world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
um, he could never be the Lord and Savior of the world if he didn't protect it through time. He could only be perhaps the Lord and Savior of the cities that he visited,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
and then once he ascended into heaven, um, that's it. If after that it was just thrown into the hands of a purely human principle,
Mm-hmm.
um, then it's the dictation of what's going to be believed is certainly going to collapse.
Yeah.
So the philosophical considerations that just you can't toss them aside. They've got to be there.
Right.
And at the
There'd be something, and I'm one of those people. Sometimes people think you can get no expectations of God from philosophy. I think that's totally wrong. I think you can get very strong expectations of God from philosophy, and it actually does a considerable amount of work, including in instances like this when you think about would revelation be necessary? If not necessary, would it be probable? And if
Sure.
it is, then what would be necessary to secure transmission or probable to secure transmission? And what would it look like in relation to other principles from philosophy, such as God's governance and according to the natures of things and stuff like that? And I think if you think really hard about that stuff, you can get pretty strong, very reasonable expectations around what we're talking about. And then you can go and see, does this actually match up? Does it conform with the historical pattern? Does it make certain predictions? Does it make accurate predictions? Or the things that we see that are not predicted or that contradict our expectations? And that's a great thing to do, right? And I think Eric would say, yeah, it does lead us to expect certain things. We actually see those certain things. There's a few anomalies here and there that, take a little bit of thinking about, but there's certainly nothing that I've seen that contradicts it or would cause me to think that this theory is a bad one or a failed one or something like that.
Yeah.
However, it's important to examine other paradigms too. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this before we get into development of doctrine. Is like, McIntyre was big about this for comparing moral theories. When you want to compare different paradigms or theories, what you should try and do is step into the paradigms, see the world through those paradigms, and see if certain paradigms can help explain deficiencies that you might see in other paradigms or failed predictions you might see in other paradigms. And I don't know, like, to my mind, like, if the Catholic paradigm wasn't true and I was looking through other paradigms, Orthodox, Protestant, I can't make sense of the papacy as it is today through those paradigms. Like, why is this thing still here? Right? For one thing, right? Right. It just seems to me, if these other paradigms were true, that it would have, if not completely disappeared, like gone off the rails in a far more obvious, easily falsifiable sense at this point, right?
Yeah.
And again, granted, there's certain anomalies. We can talk about them again that are kind of, but every theory has anomalies. That's not nothing special, right? But I would just expect it to have gone way off the rails in a much more obvious way many more times if those other theories. That just seems to me an honest prediction from those other paradigms that is not reflected in the historical pattern of reality, right? But if I look through the Catholic pattern, it would predict that, once we get clarity about what infallibility is versus impeccability and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, there's still those anomalies of like, there's little tension points here and there we got to think through. But for the most part, like, pretty much see what we would expect, right? This enduring institution that is quite consistent, right? That settles important matters with great authority and functions practically in the way that we think something like this sort of needs to be there as a practical mechanism for the reliable transmission of revelation, right? Your thoughts on everything I just put out there. Right?
Yeah, no, I think that's vital, and it's very useful, especially to gauge what would be close to the absurd notions, where God just sort of allowed things to be randomly with no fixed voice of authority, no principle of authority, that is paradigmatically designed to perpetuate itself through time to the end of time. Without those things, you would see much more chaos, and we should see the chaos. We should not see the sustenance, like you're saying. But you did mention the tension points. That that goes into the question of why we would need infallibility after the apostles die out. And the reason why we would need infallibility after the apostles died out is because disputes continue. It's not as if disputes ceased when the apostles were alive. Disputes continued, and they were augmented in ways that were never experienced by the apostles. So if there ever was a sector of time where infallibility was more needed, it would definitely be in the eras and ages after the apostles. And so to not have that organ of an infallible government that oversees the content of the faith for Christians would be devastating. It would be devastating. And so, just like Protestants recognize that the Christian religion is completely dissolved
Mhm.
if the biblical texts are fallibly produced. Catholics and Orthodox would say that the ecclesiological project of Christ
Mhm.
um, is basically dissolved if there's no infallible machinery to sustain the content of Christian faith in the face of disputes,
Mhm.
because the multi-directional path that man, when it's left to men, especially in the when church and state began to work together, emperors took things in all kinds of directions, and if they were the ones to determine the Christian faith, then the Christian faith turned around a bunch of times. It was a
Yeah.
spinning religion. Um, so both Catholics and Orthodox believe in the endurance of the infallible organ. It's not just nestled in the apostles. It still gets perpetually possessed by the post-apostolic church. So the question now between Catholics and Orthodox is, how does that infallibility get exhibited? How
Mhm.
does it get applied? What are we supposed to look for as a criterion for its activity? So that way we can give our senses to it. And, the Orthodox say ecumenical councils, Catholics say ecumenical councils,
Mhm.
but then the nature of councils becomes a question, right?
Right.
We would say that just because you have 500 bishops get together doesn't necessarily mean that what they decide is infallible
Mhm.
and definitive. There's certain principles that validate councils and therefore invalidate councils.
Mhm.
So now councils have to go through a qualification process. And by this time, people might be thinking, well, why is Christianity so like, I thought this was supposed to be something so simple, and Jesus loves us, and we have the Bible. So the thing is, you wouldn't even have a Bible today if we didn't have all of these eh, you know very, very detailed projects of intellectual distinctions,
Mhm.
um, to actually compile a Bible. That in and of itself, it rests upon centuries of doing this kind of thing.
Mhm.
So, and then also how to deal with historical problems in the Bible itself, how to deal with um, what looks to be like contradictions between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for example. Well, Christians have always had ways of reconciling these things, and in that process, they they have to adopt using terms that get into what we're talking about here, the difference
Mhm.
between substance, form. All these things become necessary to convey the credibility of the Christian faith. Well, it's the same way when it comes to how infallibility continues after the apostles.
Mhm.
So we all believe that ecumenical councils are infallible, but a council itself has to be qualified by a certain head and member dynamic,
Mhm.
and the head and the members, the body of bishops, uh, that has to be principled by what we believe was created by Christ with Peter
Mhm.
and in the other 11. So when Christ created Peter's primacy, he created this head and member dynamic of government.
Mhm.
So that means that in the post-apostolic era, you're going to have a head and member dynamic that's going to follow the same species,
Right.
Peter
Mhm.
and his successors.
Mhm.
So it's going to be the heir of Peter who's currently reigning, who's
Mhm.
currently living in office. Okay. He has to either call the council. Obviously, we know historically that emperors call the councils, but the popes always set the agenda.
Yep.
So the pope has to either call the council, oversee its, the acts of the council, uh, and finally ratify the council in conjunction with the other bishops. That's what makes a council ecumenical. If you don't have any of those things, then you don't. If you don't have the body of bishops and you just have the Pope that showed up, you don't have a council, right? So it's not just like the Pope can be his one-man council either, right? So ecumenical councils are infallible, but according to those principles. Now, the Pope himself can speak infallibly. Of course, we've talked about this before, and of course, where that comes from is both what we just described, where we all agree that infallibility is needed, because when there's a question of faith at hand and there's heterodoxy and orthodoxy on either side of the fence, we have to know which one is true and which one we have to believe. Well, that means that the church has to have the power to unify its own content of faith. Now, in history, do we see that?
Yeah.
Do we actually see that happening?
Right.
And here's where I think that the debate should be settled, okay, between the Catholics and the Orthodox. There's many ways to settle the debate, but here's where I think it should be settled. In 3 of the 7 ecumenical councils, okay, those 3 councils specify the supremacy of power in St. Peter and his successors in faith, morals, and discipline. So even on the rule of, well, only ecumenical councils are infallible, even if we go with that very simplistic rule, well, 3 of them already specified what Catholics are trying to give the Orthodox through our olive branch and dialogue as a sine qua non of the Christian faith. So the doctrine of the papacy ends up getting into their councils. So we don't even need to, we don't even need to talk about if the Pope is necessary. Obviously, the Orthodox don't believe that. Let's just look at what ended up being said in these councils.
Right.
And that's all we would have to do. And then that should open the mind and say, well, wow, if I believe these 7 councils are infallible, and 3 of them, namely the Council of Ephesus 431, the Council of Constantinople 681, and the Council of Nicaea 2 in 787, all 3 of these councils contain statements by the popes that were read out loud at the councils bilingually in Greek and Latin, and were put into the acta, the official documents of the council, all which specify Vatican I. And in some cases, it's even more extreme than what Vatican I said. So we're not even talking about like seed to tree type of stuff. We're talking about like it's already more.
It's the forest, right?
Yeah. So we don't even have to quibble on the issue of what makes a council infallible with the Orthodox. All we have to do is just flip the pages and see what's already in there. And what we find is this Christo-Petrine architecture, meaning Christ to Peter, to S. Petrus, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I call it the Christo-Petrine architecture. In short, to refer to what we teach at Vatican I on the pastoral dogma of the Roman Pontiff. That is already embedded into the 7 ecumenical councils. It's part of the faith of those councils. And so if we ever enter into a domain where we don't believe that anymore, we're not just sacrificing what Catholics believe to be a matter of divine revelation. We're also subtracting from what the Orthodox already believe is unchangeable, namely those councils, those 7 councils. So based on that, one of my arguments in the book is that the Orthodox are obliged by their own sources to admit the infallibility of the Roman Pontiff as the heir and successor of St. Peter, and that councils follow and councils of bishops always have to follow the authoritative direction of the successor of St. Peter as a sine qua non principle before the contents are to be considered universally binding.
Yeah.
And so with that, I think the evidence is clear. But you do have issues because you do have popes who have erred in the past.
Mm-hmm.
This seems to be quite conclusive. The
Yeah.
historians and theologians today all admit this. So what it kind of looks like Catholics are doing when we say that not everything the Pope says is infallible, only when he speaks ex cathedra. What it kind of looks like to outsiders is we have the chessboard set up. The Catholic side, the king is about to be put into checkmate. We see it and we make moves to prevent.
Yeah, we're just avoiding
from
falsification, complicating. So I want to go there in a second, but I want to highlight what you said because I think it's really powerful. It's very simple, but also a very powerful consideration. It's say, hey, even according to the Orthodox paradigm, you should believe the Catholic paradigm, right? And to avoid that, you would have to pretty much destroy the foundations for the Orthodox paradigm, right?
Yes.
And that's that does seem to be a powerful consideration. And while if somebody thinks that papal infallibility is untrue for this is what I'm getting from it, Eric, for other reasons, say because you think that it has been contradicted in the historical record. To me, that wouldn't mean be orthodox. It just mean be neither, right?
Exactly.
Given just what you said, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
You went through all the you got to the heart of like so my book is, I told you 800 pages. Towards the back of the book where I give a comprehensive historical analysis and then a final reflection. Part of that final reflection is namely this. If the papacy is false, we don't get the benefit of saying, okay, now I get to be orthodox. Because if the papacy is false, the other side of the blade has already cut into the Orthodox sources just as much as the Catholic sources.
Yep.
And so you end up having a double homicide to both Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And so what that leaves us with is the cheering from the Protestants because they basically they're watching us lop our own heads off.
Don't worry, friends. The blade's coming through to you pretty soon as well.
Right. And I do explain. I do explain why the Protestant option is just entirely difficult, too difficult to accept. But what it does is it's taking us to that checkmate against Christianity. If we don't want that to happen, there are a number of moves that we have to make on the board. And I think one of them is that Catholicism has to be true.
And man, I completely agree with you. I've said it before in this podcast and, even before our conversations in my investigations of moving away from naturalism to theism to religion, it did seem to me that it was Catholicism or bust for Christianity.
Right.
And if Catholicism were falsified, it's not like I wouldn't like orthodoxy probably wouldn't even be an option for me. Like it just wouldn't be. Like I'd be looking to like a broad Neoplatonism, religious pluralism, which I was flirting with before, right? Before the Catholic. So I don't know, if that comes off the wrong way, but that really just was my sort of assessment of it for all these various reasons that we've kind of been dancing around and teasing. It's like, wow, yeah, it just seems like for this to really be credible, Christianity, it's this paradigm that seems to kind of hold it all together. And if that is unraveled, then it just seems to all of it just kind of fall apart. Now, it's hard to spell out exactly why that is. It takes a lot of time, but we've been indicating, I think, some of those reasons, many of them epistemological for sure. Right.
Yeah. You got exactly what I'm trying to say. That's exactly what I'm trying to say.
So that's that. Right. So two things I want to cover. I do want to get to development of doctrine because I think it does need to be addressed that, hey, when you Catholics talk about development of doctrine, you're just, you guys are just, just trying to complicate your theory and you're making all these contrived moves to avoid falsification. So I do want to get there in a minute. I also want to take questions from the audience if they want to send those in as well. But first, I just want to come back to that simple argument because that just seems very powerful. And clearly the Orthodox have to have pushback against that. But you've had three, not just one, but three ecumenical councils that you believe, again, according to the Orthodox paradigm, should have them accept the Catholic paradigm, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, they have to be aware and studied of these councils, right?
Yeah.
So how are they trying to avoid these implications? And why don't you think those attempts at avoiding them are ultimately any good, is what I'm asking. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so the Orthodox are not, I mean, it's not like they're unaware of these things. So what I've seen from two very reliable Orthodox historians, so one of them, he's not a historian, he's a theologian, Father Lauren Kleinenwerk. So he's a recent author. He wrote a book called His Broken Body. It's one of the go-to books to get a Orthodox perspective on these matters, and he goes so far as to say, yes, uh, there seems to be in the text of those councils um, pretty much a full-blown recognition of what is essential to Vatican I.
Mm-hmm.
But he kind of takes the view that the Orthodox didn't really take a literal interpretation of that. And so one route to go is to say, well, yeah, that's what it says, but it could be just exaggerative. It could be exaggerated language. Um, kind of like when you find statements about the Byzantine emperor being um, protected by God, or the true son of David, or the most loved and precious figure on the planet to benefit the fruit of all the churches. You have a lot of this, in other words, classical Roman um, etiquette when it comes to addressing a dignitary. Do you see what I'm saying? And so sometimes they'll appeal to this Byzantine flattery or hyperbolic language. So you don't take that literally, all right? Um, or for example, the Church of Jerusalem, it was always hallowed because it was the city that our Lord gave up his life, right? And so you find some people saying Jerusalem will never turn away from the faith, things like that. Well, hello, obviously Catholics don't believe Jerusalem is infallible or the Patriarch of Jerusalem is infallible. Why would you say that about the Roman Patriarch? Well, the reason why we would do this is this would take a little bit more work. In my book, that's why the book is so big, is because you have to go century by century, author by author, statement by statement, context by context, to see if the hyperbole explanation fits.
Yeah.
If it fits, then hey, the Orthodox have a way of getting around that.
Mm-hmm.
But that has to be demonstrated, just like my position has to be demonstrated.
Mm-hmm.
So without going into all the examples, it would just take going through what's being said. Because if we just decide to say, well, whenever the fathers and councils say things that I don't like, I'll call it hyperbole.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever they say things I do like, that's reality. Well, then what are we going to say about all the poetic stuff about the Virgin Mary being sinless and hearing our prayers?
Mm-hmm.
Is that hyperbole or is that reality? Oh, well, that's so you have to be careful with just throwing out the hyperbole explanation. Let the context, the people, the statement itself, the consequences are around it. So I'll give you an example. When somebody has to obey Rome when it really pains them to do so, and they say the reason why is because they have to abide by the design of Jesus and the government of the church, that's a pretty good indication that he's not talking about hyperbole.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
The other thing that they do is they'll say that, well, that's what the West believed, but the Greek bishops didn't internally believe it. So those statements in those councils are reflecting a Western agenda that the Greek bishops didn't internalize. Does that make sense?
It does. I just think it's a really weak response.
Well, the reason why it doesn't work is because what is it that counts in the text of the Old New Testament and the ecumenical councils? Is it what's written
Right.
or what we personally feel about it? It's always what's written.
Yeah, it's what's meant to be communicated, right?
That's right. So even if the Greek bishops, were biting biting the bullet when the copyists were, the people who were transcribing the minutes of the council, when they actually, do we have to put that in there about this Peter thing and the successor of Peter, and all right, fine, let it go. Even if they were like that, they still let it go.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying? But it's kind of ridiculous. That's not how it was. Many of the Greek bishops were exuberantly relying on the authority of the apostolic see for the triumph of orthodoxy.
Yeah.
So there's that. You would be surprised, Pat. A lot of Orthodox aren't even aware that the ecumenical councils even talk about these things. They're still looking at how Peter's not the rock in Matthew 16.
Oh,
You know what I'm saying?
still in that one, yeah.
Yeah, some of these councils are all, they say that, all 7 of them might even say that. Some of them are still wondering if that's true and if it means anything related to the Roman pontiff. So a lot of Orthodox I've spoken to aren't aware. Some of the more, you take like what we hear today from like Ubi Petrus or Jay Dyer, which the two of them are actually very different on how they understand this issue. But take Ubi Petrus, for example. He takes the position that, oh, well, the successor of St. Peter in Rome, he was the head primate, but he was sort of like a universal archbishop. So he's not like what Catholics believe, that is directly and immediately invested with universal jurisdiction and the power of infallible teaching. But he's got some canonically restricted responsibilities. Obviously, the universal church can't make universal confessions without him. So he's got a hefty responsibility, a hefty role, but it's not what Catholics believe. And so that seems to be gaining a lot of traction for some reason online. And my response to that would be, that doesn't make sense of the origins of the Roman primacy, because if the origins of the Roman primacy are rooted in Scripture, the words of Christ, then it really doesn't matter if it is this canonically restricted thing. It still can't go away. And so the Orthodox believe it's been completely dormant for 1,000 years. So even if we were to say, well, yeah, Rome was the primate, yeah, Rome was the head of the churches, but what specifically could she do? Well, we think it's much less than Vatican I. All right, but you still have to abide by what's being said in those councils, right? That it was created by Jesus, and that he created it divinely, and that he created for the purpose of the unity of the churches. Well, if you're going to say that it's been gone for 1,000 years, then what you're saying is that what Jesus created to be essential in the church has been ripped out of the church. So it's kind of like etching out elements of human DNA. It's changing the nature of something, which is why most Orthodox don't even believe in what Ubi Petrus teaches about the Roman primacy. The most popular church today, the largest church, the Russian Orthodox Church, doesn't come anywhere close to that kind of an explanation on the Roman primacy. They just believe that it was a primacy of honor.
Right.
And what they mean by that is just moral influence. His name had to be at the top of signatures. He would be the one to preside at the Eucharistic table if there was other patriarchs around, but nothing related to like canonical prerogative,
Mm-hmm.
So Yeah, I mean, we could survey a lot, but those are some popular.
No, that's really good
Yeah.
responses to each of those, Eric, and very helpful. And I hope helpful to people listening to this, because I imagine there'll be some people who are really interested in this for multiple reasons, whether they're Catholic or Orthodox, or just trying to consider each position, right? So, Eric, I do want to take questions from the audience, but I did want to hit development of doctrine at least a little bit, because I know this is
Yeah.
something you put a lot of thought into, and it relates to that other objection that we brought up a while back. It's like, hey, Catholics, is you do guys have these problematic, instances, in history, and you seem to get around it a lot of times with, certain qualifications or restrictions of what it's of what actually is infallible, or
Right.
development of doctrine. And why should I take any of that seriously? Isn't this all just a contrived attempt to avoid falsification? So yeah, Eric, would like your thoughts on how you think through and handle those sorts of things.
Yeah. So, I this might be a little bit of a shocker to some people. I don't know if I come fully folded with Newman on this issue.
Hmm.
Okay. So it seems to be something taken for granted by a lot of people that if you believe in the development of doctrine, then you believe everything that St. John Henry Newman said about it. And
Right.
and,
Yeah.
and that's not true, right?
Hmm.
So I think I'm very close to him. So what I would say is this, that um an idea has consequences,
Hmm.
right? Now, not every adherent to a specific idea is always aware of the consequences of an idea the moment that the idea is delivered.
Totally. Right. Hmm.
So we have the idea of Christian revelation, but then there's the issue of what are the consequences that are native to the idea. So the idea actually doesn't increase in its substance, but there are things that are inherent within the idea that do get learned, you
Teased
know,
out. Hmm.
teased out, and implications, unpacking or unfolding of a certain idea. So, for example, the doctrine of original sin. Okay, that was a tough one. Okay, not every single author in the first, second, third century was speaking with a full consciousness of the implications of what Paul taught in Romans 5,
Hmm.
Ephesians 2, what David meant in Psalm 51. In sin, my mother can see. Not everybody kind of drew out all the implications of how it applied to different facets of theology, because theology is a web. Everything's interconnected. So it's like looking at street traffic from a bird's eye view. There's all this traffic going on, and it's all interconnected.
Hmm.
And so you're not always aware of how an idea is going to react to its applications at different times in different places.
Yeah.
um, so development of doctrine is not adding new beliefs. It's simply unpacking what has been believed at different times. So
And
when it
the
comes,
reason this is important is if it is a consequence, right, then it's not a theoretical add-on, and it doesn't
right.
decrease the prior probability of that theory. That's why that's significant from an evaluative standpoint, right?
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So uh, when it comes to the papacy, um, we obviously have this idea that there was a headship created in the church, in the government of the church. The apostles had this, Petrine leadership. All the details about it, all the definitions about it weren't really explicitly heralded. Maybe you might have had some Christian genius in the year 71 that may have written it all out, and then it got
Sure.
thrown away.
Mhm.
Um, but for both the strong and the weak, this thing tends to take time. You know, you have some minds that could see through it all, but that's a very rare gift.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so you have this headship in the apostles, and as it goes through time, there's a number of things that we recognize that need to be that head needs to be equipped with in order to get its job done. So, in order to unify the churches, the bishops, and the Christians of the whole world, you have to have the power of unification. Now, how do you have the power of unification if there is no gravitational force that's impelling towards some influential effect from that head?
Mm-hmm.
It can't, you know? So if the well-being and the health of the Christian church depends on if we're believing the right things, if we have the right disciplinary direction for the moral life, the prayer life, the liturgical life, all these things are part of the health of the church, then that means that the government of the church has to have the power to protect those things. And then if you peel a little bit further back, you're going to end up finding this nugget of universal jurisdiction and the power of infallibility when it comes to defining the Christian faith. Because as soon as we say no, the Pope does not have the power to do that. The Pope does not have jurisdiction outside of Rome. The Pope cannot enforce decisions and commands foreign to the Italian peninsula. As soon as you start saying those things, then what happens is you start to level the Pope with every other bishop. And then now all those prerogatives that you say you believed about him become senseless, because now he doesn't really have the power to be different than any other bishop. And so he's just as good as any other bishop. So when you say, yeah, the Pope is the head of all the churches, well, that's effectively just as good as me being a lay person in Croatia,
Mm-hmm.
because he could do just as much as I can do in relation to the universal church.
Mm-hmm.
Basically nothing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So in order to get the Pope's jobs, in order for his role to be applicable, there are all these things that are embedded into the necessity of of what he has to be empowered to do.
Right.
And I
And
think
so,
that's what took the development.
yeah, and sometimes that just takes time sometimes it just takes time to tease out the consequences of a theory. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
just the case for a lot of things, right? A lot of different theories. So very, very good. In fact, that I think actually is a nice segue into questions, because one of the questions here is, what model of development of doctrine do you accept? Is there anyone out there that you can point to and say, this is the one that I think is closest to my perspective, or what?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. That's a good question. So so this gets into a debate with people who love St. John Henry Newman, and those who might be a little bit critical of some of the things he said. So, one of the things that's possible to criticize in St. John Henry Newman's model of development is it seems as though his understanding of development includes not just necessarily logical inference. So, if you have an idea and that there's implications of the idea, we're only going to accept as implicit what is necessarily implicit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, a tautology, really. Um, Anything that's merely coherent doesn't qualify as an implication.
Mm-hmm.
So we can come up with all kinds of coherent things to add to the idea, which would then be adding to the idea.
Mm-hmm.
See? Because merely coherence is not sufficient to spell out an authentic development. Now, I think Newman does cover that in his 7 notes on what makes of an authentic development, but he certainly didn't specify it. And that's one of the things I might say I wish he did more,
Mm-hmm.
is that there needs to be something truly native to the idea, not just consistent with the idea. Because
Yep.
I can come up with things that are very consistent with all kinds of ideas
Oh, sure.
that
Mm-hmm.
are not native. It's not commensurate. I mean, it's not.
It's not something that either definitely or highly probably follows from the idea.
Yeah,
right? Out of
exactly.
the idea or flows
Yeah,
from it, right? Hmm.
exactly. So, I mean, Newman might say, well, the perpetual virginity is not something that is necessary. But see, the early Christians would say it was taught in Isaiah and Ezekiel with certain typology and assumption of Mary. Is that necessary? Well, again, that you have an argument from Scripture. You have an argument from early traditional eyewitness accounts. So I think that if you want to pick up one guy, I think I have his book around, is Matthew Levering.
Oh yeah, yeah. Dr. Levering's great. Yep. Hmm.
He has a book. Oh, I thought I had it with me somewhere. He wrote a book on. It's called "The Development of Doctrine." It's new. It was published by Word on Fire like last year, um, and he does the best, I think, of really detailing this issue. He goes through Newman and his interaction with other great thinkers in history. I would say that Levering, I'm very confident in following Levering, Matthew Levering.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Awesome. I will endorse his work as well. He's got a lot of great stuff out there on a variety of subjects,
He just
actually.
does so much homework. His
Yeah.
footnotes are incredible.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Let's turn to this one. Here's more of a practical question. Meow 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 says, "What do you do if you think you have strong arguments against the claim made by the Pope, but have trouble actually, like, I guess, assessing the overall situation?" And then, P.S. Not just the Pope, but the Catechism. What would you advise in this situation, Eric? Mhm.
Yeah. So what do we do if we believe we have strong arguments against a certain claim made by the Pope, but we have um, well, you see, this you might get different answers from different Catholics. Okay, so um, I haven't been given any directions or permissions from my bishop in saying this, but um, when I talk to a Protestant, for example, I expect him to be open to the possibility that Presbyterianism is false. Right? I expect him as a dialogue partner to be open to that. Should the Catholic be open to being wrong when he goes into the dialogue ring or the debate ring? Some people would say no, because that's a violation of divine faith, because part of divine faith is being certain, right? Um, but I would say that, if you're having enough trouble, then part of being a faithful Catholic is giving yourself the responsibility of doing the work to try to overcome the problem, and being patient too. I wouldn't even tell a Protestant to immediately leave his confession if he's not in conscience comfortable with doing that. So you've got to do your due diligence and overcome what your conscience tells you to do. Um, so if you have enough problems and you think that you've reached a falsification proof for Catholicism, and you've exhausted all your measures, you've talked with all of the best, and the best apologists in the world, all the bishops of the world, and you still have a problem, okay, there's one of two things. Cardinal Newman said a problem doesn't equal a doubt, right? So you can live with that problem. There are certainly some problems I live with as a Catholic.
Mhm.
There are some things that if you ask me about them, I will tell you I don't have a solution for that. And
Right,
I've had some people come up to me and give me a very hard time about that.
right.
The Look, I just think that the solutions that are being thrown out there are not good enough.
Yeah.
So I just wait. Maybe somebody will come up with a solution.
And that's so important and honest, because you're not doing anybody any favors. You're certainly not doing yourself any favors. First off, if you're lying, that's just a sin, right? So you should never lie and say that you think you know the answer to something when you don't. But also, you're just not doing anybody ever favors by just putting something out there that you don't think is correct. But I also want to strongly agree with you, Eric, is that not having a solution to something doesn't mean that not seeing the solution doesn't mean that you see that there is no solution.
Right.
And that's critical, right? Just because you don't see a solution to something doesn't mean that there isn't a solution. It just means currently you don't see it, right?
Right.
And that isn't the worst thing in the world, right? There's a lot of things out there where there's tensions, there's problems, and we just don't, and we shouldn't expect that we're going to see the solution
That's
to
right.
everything all the time.
That's right.
And so, not to interrupt too much, Eric, but
No, feel free.
when
Yeah.
when it comes to this question, I was actually reading as somebody who's maybe looking into Catholicism, but not somebody who's already there and having doubts. I would also say, what is the total overall evidential situation too, right? Because
Yeah.
say you've got good reasons to think that there's a strong case for epistemic authority, right? Because the case for authority extends beyond Catholicism. It has a special application to Catholicism. But there's general matters where there might be authorities in science, and you think you might have an argument against that authority, but admittedly, you're not extremely well versed. You think the argument's kind of strong, but you have trouble kind of assessing it. Well, there might be an overall argument of why it would be more rational for you to go with the authority, even if you haven't had your specific argument addressed, right? And this was actually a practical position I was in with Catholicism for a while, because I was evaluating it for a while, and I was making a lot of worldview shifts at this time, and I came to these positions on authority, and it seems like the Catholic Church, it seems like it's making a lot of accurate hits and predictions on a lot of things. But there were a few points where I was like, I'm not sure if I agree with that. Certain, issues I was still working out. Yeah. But I felt like at the end, they're like, who the hell am I? Right? Right? Like if the Catholic Church is true, this is a mechanism that far exceeds my capabilities, right?
Right.
Far exceeds my capabilities. And it seems like it's got so much going for it that even if there's these other points where I don't see the solution, or I even still somewhat disagree, the overall weight is so much against me that the rational thing I should do at this point, unless like I'm definitely sure that there's a contradiction, I'm positive it, there's no way out of it, which was not my position, right? I should just go with it. I should just go with it in light of and then lo and behold, I did. And then quickly, eventually I did find solutions. I was like, oh yeah, I was wrong about that. Church was right, right? But I didn't wait. Till I worked out every single little thing and had a solution to every. First off, you'll never be able to do that. There's that is practically impossible. For me, it was just, did I work out enough? Was there enough there? And all the other aspects that go into conversion, which are very significant. I think it's just a mistake on many levels to think that like you have to go through the entire list of everything the church teaches and clear that entire list. God would not demand that of people. That's unreasonable. That's not what you should do. So I'm glad you answered the question from the framework from within the church. I was seeing it as from without the church. And I'd be curious, do you agree with everything I just said, Eric? And what would you advise in that situation as well?
No, yeah. The same. Yeah, absolutely. The very same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. I hope that helps. Meow. Let us know if you want to clarify that all. All right, let's take a few more here. AD says, why do you think Vatican I was defined so late, and is there a plausible reason for this?
Yeah, so the idea that the Apostolic See is the final arbiter on the Christian faith, that gets heralded pretty loud in both East and West already in the 5th and 6th century. Not in any kind of dogmatic formulae, but it gets recognized on public documents that are being copied everywhere. So the atmosphere of recognition is there very early, 6th century, and some people might say, well, the 6th century is too late. Well, for Catholics and Orthodox, 6th century is not late. That's right there in the midst of our union in the first 1,000 years. In the 12th century, or rather the 13th century, with the Council of Lyons, 1274, there is a definition about papal power that says all doctrinal questions are finally settled by the Roman pontiff. So that's kind of basically Vatican I already, in 1274. So that's, we're talking 600 years before 1870. What happens around 1870 is it's following up on some leading controversies, um, prior to the 19th century, namely the various forms of conciliarism and the um, the certain forms of secular historicism, um, that was taking place in scholarship by that time, um, which sort of it took people away from believing that the church had the infallible power to define faith, and making it as if the historians and the theologians are the ones that have the authority to define what Christians believe. So you have conciliarism, and you basically have modernism. Um, and what the Catholic Church recognized that it needed to do was make a definition in order to squelch out all of these opportunistic models that were alternate from the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it had to go into all the details that it said about immediate jurisdiction, because you had those who said, no, we believe the papacy, but we believe it's mediated, right?
Mm-hmm.
We also have people who say that, um, it's it's mediated and indirect. Well, the Vatican I definition says no, it's immediate and direct. So you had some people who were very close in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
They wanted to believe the papacy. They were full blown papal supremacists,
Mm.
but they were fiddling with the description of
Sure.
what the papacy could do.
Mm-hmm.
So they all accepted papal infallibility, but some of them said, yes, the Pope's infallible, just after he gets the consensus of all the whole
Mm-hmm.
church. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So they were all like, the idea of papal infallibility, they all knew that that was antique.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a matter of how it was framed, if that makes sense.
It does. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's why it took so long.
Yeah. Great response. You got time for one or two more here, Eric?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Let's do. Here's a good one. ND Irish wants to know, what's the best critical feedback you've received of your book so far? It hasn't been out too long yet, but have you gotten any?
So I haven't gotten any critical feedback. Um, I got some redundant feedback. Somebody who did not read the book said um, that I could have written it in 50 pages because the papacy doesn't exist anyway, but they didn't read the book. So that's so far that's the only bad thing I've heard.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think I need to submit it to some Eastern Orthodox reviewers, um, and perhaps some journals that might be able to put it under the critical fire of an Eastern Orthodox mind. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's due,
Mm-hmm.
and I wish to obtain that soon.
Yeah. Jacob says you should become Maronite. It is the one true church without stain among the churches. Your thoughts
Oh,
on this?
so that's so that particular claim. Some people could say, well, the Maronites were always faithful, right? They were always, they don't seem to be the cause of any controversy
Now, for
in
people
history.
who aren't familiar, Maronites are in full communion with Rome.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes, they are. And but it would be difficult to try and assess this claim as a point to in contradistinction from the Catholic principle of the papal primacy, because the Maronites have always held the papal communion as intrinsic to the faith.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're without stain in the faith, then consubstantial with their faith is the papacy.
Right. We're covered by it.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how the consequences seem to be fully acceptable by me, but I'm not sure why I would have to become a Maronite. In other words.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. Eric, before we wrap this one up, hold up your book, please, because I know you had it right there. Let's see
Yeah.
that beautiful cover.
I actually took the cover off.
Oh no!
This is
Just when
mine.
it was time for show and tell, right?
Actually, I no, it's too high up there. I could get them down. I have a whole box of them, but um, my personal one that I'm taking notes in. I'm just because there's more that I do. I read more.
Of course. Yep.
And I add things that add that bolster things that I've said, and I add it in there just in case somebody questions me later. So, but and the jacket just it just gets to me.
I
Um,
always take the jackets off. Yeah.
so this is how it looks without the jacket.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
The Papacy
Out
revisiting.
from Emmaus, tremendous
Yes,
publisher. Tremendous
yeah.
publisher.
With the jacket though, it's really beautiful.
Yeah.
It really is. Several people have taken pictures of it online. You could go to my Twitter. It's on a pinned tweet I have. You could see the picture of it that I took there. So,
Or better, you can just get it and
yeah,
have
you
it
could
for
just buy it.
yourself. And I'm gonna obviously highly, highly encourage people to do that. And where would you do you have a preferred place? I know it's on Amazon, but maybe I don't know, maybe there's a secret location or just get it wherever
So,
you can get it.
so the only difference comes out in the economic way. So, I get more. Emmaus and myself get more profit if you buy it directly from St. Paul's Center for Biblical Theology. So
Yeah.
for those of you who are money concerns are not an issue of you're not conscious of necessarily, that would be the way to go if you're trying to help us out. But it's also available for those who are conscious of their spending budget on Amazon. Amazon right now actually has a limited time deal. It's like $34, where it's normally
Mm.
like 50 something
Yeah,
dollars.
that's a deal. That's a
Yeah.
deal. Definitely.
Um,
If you're
I
interested in
would
this debate, you have to take advantage of that. Mhm.
Yeah, I would just ask if you do get it from Amazon, you read it, whether you like it or don't like it, leave either a constructive criticizing comment review or one that recommends it that really helps in the Amazon
Yeah.
link. Yeah.
Yeah, well, please do it, guys. It really helps to support the people that come on the show and give us all of this incredible content and conversation. And Eric, as always, this has been a very fruitful and very fun. It's always. And by the way, gentle listeners, we never just decide, like, we never map anything out in advance. It's just
No,
always, hey, coming on, we're going to hit the button, and we're just going to go and have fun.
it
And
always
it'll
works out best that way.
I agree. I think so. Anyways, that's the way I love to do things. I like to keep things conversational and organic. But yeah, always just a joy, Eric. So, gentle listeners, please, like, share, comment, leave your thoughts, agree, disagree. That's what the comment section is there for. Eric's book is called The Papacy: Revisiting the Debate Between Catholics and Orthodox, out through Emmaus. Please do grab yourself a copy, and we will see all of you on the next episode. Eric, thank you so much.